Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, Weird and Haunted Illinois with Troy Taylor. This is Rachel Blomquist, librarian at the Putnam County Public Library District. Before we begin, just a few reminders. On Tuesday, October 21st at 6 p.m. Central, the library will virtually host Catherine Hamilton Smith for her presentation on the picture postcard. From elegant Victorian-era designs to playful cartoons, postcards have captured everyday life for over a century. This program is presented by the Illinois Humanities with support from the National Endowment for Humanities, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and other generous contributors. All library programming is free and open to the public. It is also shareable, so please feel free to share the information with others. And now, let's welcome Troy Taylor. Troy is the author of more than 150 books on history, hauntings, true crime, the unexplained, and the supernatural in America. He is the founder of American Hauntings, Inc., which offers books, events, and ghost tours, and is the owner of the American Oddities Museum in Alton, Illinois. He is also the writer and co-host of the American Hauntings podcast. He has appeared in numerous television shows and documentaries. Troy?
Hey, well, thanks for having me here, and thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. I'm going to share my screen here and see if we can't get things going. And hopefully everyone can see that the way that they're supposed to. Well, it can always be an adventure using Zoom. So anyway, let's get started. Well, that's theoretically, we're going to get started. Let me try that again. And there we go. Let's see. And still nothing. Gosh, guys, I'm so sorry. We are not having much luck here. Well, we had it working just a minute ago. All right, let me try this again. Sorry, guys. There. Okay, now I think we've got it. Okay, hopefully you can all see everything. So let's try this and see if we can get the slides to actually go from one to the next. And they're not working. Well, I'm so sorry. I will get this going here.
Take your time.
I'm so sorry. We had it working. Rachel and I had it going. For some reason. Okay, how about now? Do we go on to it? Okay, now we're rolling. Okay. Thanks, guys. Sorry. All right. So Illinois is a very haunted place. Just about every neighborhood in every town, large and small, has its share of ghost stories and haunted houses. And being born and raised here, I've been searching for them for most of my life. As we've already mentioned, I've been a speaker, tour company owner, and writer for the past 32 years. Now, some of you might recognize my name as the author of books like Weird Illinois or Haunted Illinois, and quite a few others. 32 years is a long time to be writing about ghosts and true crime and haunted places. So I've got a collection of files filled with stories from pretty much everywhere in the state. So when I started digging into those files for this evening, I had a hard time deciding what I wanted to leave in and what I wanted to take out. So I decided to offer you a look at a few of my favorite local haunts and frightening stories from around the state. Now, some will be new, some might be familiar, and in some cases, the story you think you know may not be the true story after all. But regardless, I hope you enjoy all of them. So I want to start with some of the hauntings that have been reported in your neighborhood, which is kind of a mixture of firsthand accounts, legends, lore, and real life hauntings. There are several places where you might come face to face with some of the ghostly residents in your pretty much immediate area. The Ninth Street Pub in LaSalle has been a popular restaurant and tavern since the late 1960s. In the early days, the pub was located right next door to the home of an elderly woman named Mrs. Sonnenberg. Although she liked the proprietor of the tavern, John Ebener, she hated the fact that the noisy tavern with its rowdy crowds and all its live music was located so close to her home. So she constantly, although they say good naturedly, harassed John about this for years until she passed away one day in the mid 1970s. Well, Mrs. Sonnenberg apparently died under some mysterious circumstances, which have still not been fully explained. Her body was not discovered for several days after her death, and when she was found, having passed away from a stroke, she was locked inside her bedroom closet. And it's been surmised that perhaps she was getting something out of the closet, suffered the stroke, and then collapsed there, somehow locking the door behind her. Well, John Ebener later purchased a small house next door to his pub, knocked down some walls, and incorporated it into the tavern. The house now became part of the pub, including the closet where Mrs. Sonnenberg died, which is located next to the restrooms today. Well, soon after the work was finished, the staff began to realize that strange things were taking place in the bar, mostly in the section that had been the old house. Lights began turning on and off by themselves, doors open and close, footsteps were heard even when no one else was present. Customers and staff members have often complained of feeling as if they've been touched or had their hair or clothing tugged on in that part of the tavern, as if someone was trying to get their attention. One day, a brand new bartender who knew nothing about the tavern or that it was alleged to be haunted walked into the side of the bar near the pool tables and was chilled to hear the disembodied voice of an old woman asking, "What in the hell are you doing here?" Well, the bartender turned to see who it was and found the place was empty. It seems that Mrs. Sonnenberg is still protective of her home, even from beyond the grave. And of course, there is the Hotel Kaskaskia, which was built in 1915 by the architects of the luxurious Drake and Blackstone hotels in Chicago. It was meant to be a big city hotel in a small town, and it opened at a time when LaSalle was on the verge of becoming a major manufacturing town for cement and zinc. It was also the home to Westclox, one of America's leading timepiece companies in the early 1900s. Well, once it was completed, the hotel attracted customers from Chicago and all over the Midwest and played host to lavish parties, receptions, weddings, and more. Well, the hotel enjoyed great success for many years, but eventually fell on hard times and closed down for quite a while. But before and after that time, staff members and guests have complained about phantom voices, eerie sounds, and doors that open and close on their own. Elevators in the hotel have a habit of behaving very strangely. They tend to travel to floors where no one is found. And the staff elevator would take employees to floors they hadn't pushed the buttons to reach, especially to the basement. Well, the most famous ghost of the Kaskaskia is that of a young woman who plunged to her death from the six-story ballroom in the late 1940s. At one end of the room was a balcony that offered a full view of the surrounding area. No one knows what happened to cause this woman to fall. The official story was suicide, but rumors have swirled for decades that she may have been murdered. Regardless of how she died, it seems she's haunted the ballroom ever since. Staff members and guests have reported hearing the sound of her dance shoes clicking across the floor throughout the day and night. On many occasions, guests on the fifth floor have heard music playing and someone walking around in the ballroom above them. A check of the room has always revealed a locked and abandoned ballroom, and the staff simply dismiss the sounds as one last dancer, still looking for her partner after all these years. And while ghosts might be scary to some people, what about a real life vampire? One of the strangest tales in the area is that of the shadowy figure who lurks in the old Lithuanian cemetery in Spring Valley. Witnesses claim they found dogs, cats, and small animals drained of blood in the old graveyard, always around the old Massic mausoleum. It's the final resting place of the Masick brothers, who were prominent meat packers in the area. And while the identity of the so-called resident vampire is unknown, it's believed the tomb is its home and it emerges from inside to feed. Well, the stories have circulated since the 1960s. And one night, several men came to the cemetery to see if the stories were true, only to come face to face with a tall, gaunt figure that they claimed, quote, radiated evil. Well, one of the men brought a handgun with him and reportedly shot the creature at point blank range. Well, when the bullets had no effect, they fled the graveyard in terror. Well, after the story got out, a group of researchers from Chicago came to see the tomb for themselves. They arrived around dusk, which seems like a terrible idea to me when you're chasing a vampire. But anyway, they claim they emptied a bottle of holy water on the mausoleum door in an attempt to keep the vampire trapped inside. But when they heard a terrible groaning from the interior of the tomb, they also fled the cemetery. Well, the story is still often told today. And while most people consider it nothing more than a local legend, there aren't a lot of people who are brave enough to visit the cemetery after dark. Now, even outside of your immediate area, Northern Illinois remains a spooky place. Of course, not everyone believes in ghosts, and many find such stories easy to explain away by saying it's hard to take scary stories seriously when they're told by one person. But what about when a story is told by an entire town? And the mystery is so bizarre that it's still unsolved today. In the early 1860s, strange rumors were making their way through the town of Middleport, Illinois, which was not yet known as Watseka. The eerie rumors were about a teenager named Mary Roff and the strange spells from which she was suffering. Her schoolmates were often terrified when she fell to the ground, her body twisting and contorting into frightening shapes. She cried out, speaking in a strange tongue, or she would become catatonic for hours at a time. And then there were the even more disquieting rumors that Mary could see the future. It was said that she spoke of things to come and that she knew things about people that should have no way of knowing. She would slip into some sort of trance, and, well, the things she said to people were simply too unnerving to repeat. Mary was the daughter of Asa Roff, one of the founders of Watseka, which made the rumors even more unsettling to the townspeople. It was terrible that something like this could happen to such an important family, but everyone agreed something needed to be done about Mary. Well, the Roffs couldn't agree more. By the time that Mary was in her teenage years, when the strange events that surrounded her seemed to grow worse, they were at their wits' end. Her parents took her to every doctor in the area and into Chicago. Asa Roff spared no expense in trying to get treatment for Mary, seeking out the best Illinois medical men at the time, but it was all to no avail. None of them were able to determine the cause of her seizures. So it was finally suggested that she be sent to a water cure sanitarium run by a doctor named Nevins in Peoria for treatment. These places used mineral water for treatments of everything from colds to weak constitutions, fevers, poor circulation, gout, and even alcoholism. Mary remained at Dr. Nevins' sanitarium for 18 months, during which time she improved, and relapsed several times. Her spooky seizures continued, frightening the other patients, till finally, in the late spring of 1864, she was improved enough to be sent home to Watseka. Mary seemed to be cured, and she was, for a while anyway. As summer approached, though, Mary began to complain of sharp stabbing pains in her head. The only way that she seemed to be able to stop it was by bleeding herself. She developed an obsession with blood and began stabbing herself with pins and cutting herself with a straight razor. A local doctor and druggist, F. Conrad Sechrist, was called in, and he began applying leeches to Mary. Now, bloodletting was an old medical practice that became popular again in 19th century America. It was believed that by draining the blood, balance could be restored to the body. And this was accomplished in two ways, either by cutting into a vein and letting blood escape, or by applying leeches, which took blood at a slow, predictable rate, and then they just fell off when they were full. It's the grossest thing ever. But then on the morning of July 16th, 1864, Mary took a knife and began cutting her arm, losing so much blood that she fainted. She was eventually found and taken into the house and didn't stir for hours. And when she did, she claimed not to recognize anyone in her family, nor her doctors, friends, or neighbors. Now, in addition to this peculiar development, Mary was able to speak of places where she'd never been, often with uncanny accuracy. It was almost as she had awakened as someone else. But then things got even stranger. As Mary interacted with longtime friends and neighbors that she didn't recognize, she somehow knew things about them that she wouldn't have normally known. She innocently revealed secrets about money, love affairs, and childhood events that were unknown to anyone else. Mary also began to manifest an eerie clairvoyant ability that allowed her to do everything she did during her daily life, even read and write, while wearing a blindfold. The Roffs and their friends were amazed by this startling new ability. Everyone seemed to want to test her and try to discern her methods. Local ministers, newspaper reporters, and neighbors came to the Roff home to investigate and tried to catch her playing a trick, but they were unable to figure out how she was doing it. On one occasion, she took a box of letters that had been sent to her by friends and sat down, again with a blindfold on, and read them aloud for the doctors, ministers, and businessmen who were present. Mary remained in what was referred to as her clairvoyant state for nearly a week. Then finally, she seemed to regain her own personality and began to act like herself again. She was aware of those around her, was able to greet family and friends, and lost the ability to psychically see through the blindfold. Unfortunately, knowing who she was and having strange abilities also meant that her spells and seizures returned, now worse than ever. Now, after waking from a spell, she spoke of what she saw when she was unconscious. She claimed that when she left her body, she would speak to angels, and her stories were repeated over and over, with Mary soon adding that she was visiting heaven during these journeys. Well, her family began to believe that Mary's condition had driven her mad. This led Asa and Dorothy to reluctantly accept the advice that they had been given by several of Mary's doctors. They would send her away to an insane asylum. Under a doctor's constant care, they believed she might be cured. Tragically, though, an asylum offered little chance for a real cure. The insane asylums of the 1860s were started with the best of intentions, but offered little treatment for the mentally ill. Most were simply places to keep the insane locked away from mainstream society. Mary was sent to the only state insane asylum in Illinois at the time, which was located in Jacksonville. And there, her seizures and spells continued. Asa and Dorothy made as many trips to see their daughter as possible, but visiting times were restricted by hospital officials. But the Roffs were able to come on successive days if they stayed somewhere locally. On July 5th, 1865, they were on the third day of a visit to the hospital when Mary died. She had been able to sit down with them for breakfast, but soon after had returned to her room for a nap. She tried to sleep, but was seized by a spell instead, and she died that day at the age of only 18. Her parents grieved the loss for years to come, trying to understand what had happened to her, and they sought their answers from the spirit world. In 1868, Asa Roff built the first brick home in Watseka. It still stands today on North 5th Street. His daughter Minerva and her husband, Henry Alter, took over the ownership of the original Roff house across town. Asa's business interests thrived for nearly 8 years after Mary's death. His law office was busy and he bought and sold real estate around the area. And it was during this time that the Roffs turned to the spiritualist movement, which had started about 3 decades before, based on the idea that the living could communicate with the dead and that the dead would answer. Initially, they just wanted to contact Mary, but they embraced the movement and their beliefs became well known in the community. They started a spiritualist society in Watseka and held many meetings in their home on Fifth Street. Their belief in communication with the spirit world may seem unusual today, but in 1870s America, they were far from alone. There's no clear record to say that the Roths ever contacted Mary's spirit during a seance, but they remained true believers, as proven by the events that happened next. 12 years after the death of Mary Roth in July 1877, a young girl named Lorancy Venom, who lived in Watseka, began suffering trances and seizures. During these seizures, she cried out, twisted and contorted, and would remain unconscious for hours, even days at a time. Her parents were terrified. They'd never seen anything like it before. Lorancy had been born in 1864 in a small town about 7 miles from Watseka. Her parents, Thomas and Lorinda Venom, were locals but had moved to Iowa when Lorancy was a baby. They didn't return until she was 7. This was long after Mary Roth's brief notoriety in the community and her tragic death. The Venoms knew nothing about the girl or her strange illness. Now, it was a small town, so Thomas and Lorinda knew who the Roths were, but the families lived on opposite sides of town. Asa was a lawyer and businessman. Thomas was a farmer. They had no friends in common, and for the most part, didn't patronize the same businesses. They just really had little in common, but would soon become inseparable. Lorancy Venom had never been sickly and never had an interest in ghosts or spooky stories. This is why, in the early days of July 1877, when she started talking about hearing mysterious voices in the night, her parents were baffled over what she was telling them. This continued to happen over and over, and then things got worse. Lorancy began falling into strange trances, after which she claimed to speak to angels and to cousins and members of the family who had died, including a little brother named Bertie, who had died when Lorancy was only 3. The trances continued through the end of the summer and into the fall, getting worse over time. Lorancy was taken to every doctor in Watseka and then on to those in the surrounding area. No one could find anything wrong with her. Most people, the Venoms knew, believed she was going insane. Family's minister contacted the state asylum in Jacksonville to see if the girl could be admitted there because it was the general opinion that she should be locked away. Lorancy Venom, like Mary Roth before her, was being sent to the asylum. Well, rumors spread around Watseka about Lorancy's condition and eventually reached Asa Roth. He called on the Venom family in late January 1878. Now, they were naturally skeptical about the reason for his visit and became more skeptical as he tried to explain his interest in their daughter. Asa explained that he'd become interested in Lorancy's case after hearing the rumors going around town. Lorancy claimed to have had contact with the spirits of the dead, the possibility of which, being a devout spiritualist like Asa was, he didn't doubt in the slightest. However, his real concern was about her illness. You see, he explained his daughter Mary had suffered from an almost identical condition, and she had also provided genuine evidence of supernatural powers. In 1865, it was believed that Mary was insane, but now years later, Asa was convinced she'd been of sound mind, but had fallen victim to what he called a spirit infestation. He believed the same thing was happening with Lorancy, and he urged the Venoms not to send her away to the asylum. He had made that mistake with Mary, and she had died. Asa believed he could help Lorancy and convinced the Venoms to allow him to call one more doctor to the girl's aid. If there was nothing that man could do, then they could take whatever steps they believed were necessary to save their daughter, even if that meant locking her up in the state hospital. And the Venoms reluctantly agreed. Asa Roth returned to the Venom house with spiritualist and Dr. E. Winchester Stevens. He hypnotized Lorancy and asked her to speak to the spirits who might be able to help cure her condition. Lorancy spoke of friends and distant relatives who were unknown to her, but who claimed they'd known her parents and grandparents in life. They were all now long deceased, she said. Dr. Stevens let a few more minutes pass, and then Lorancy announced she'd found a spirit who would return with her. She was a young woman who believed she could help Lorancy as no other spirit could. Well, a few minutes later, Lorancy was awakened, and Dr. Stevens asked her if she was all right and if the spirit had agreed to help her. She replied that yes, the spirit was here. But when Dr. Stevens called the girl Lorancy, she seemed confused and corrected him. She told him instead, "My name is Mary Roth." Now, as you can imagine, everyone was shocked, even Asa Roth. The session was called off for the night, and everyone left, assuming it might take some time for Lorancy to return to normal. But she didn't. The next day, Thomas Venom went to Asa Roth's office and insisted he return to see Lorancy, who was still insisting that she was actually Mary Roth. When he arrived, he brought his wife and his daughter Minerva with him. When Lorancy saw them coming up the walk outside, she called out, "Here comes Ma Nervy," using a nickname for Minerva that only Mary ever used. Well, when they left, an entire day of weeping and crying followed, which led the Venoms to allow Lorancy to stay with the Roths for a short time. Well, she was thrilled, but confused when they were driving to the Roth home. She thought they were going to the original family home where Minerva now lived. Mary had never been to the new house. It was built after she died. Well, Lorancy, or Mary, immediately began calling Asa and Dorothy Pa and Ma and recognized every member of the family. Although Lorancy Venom knew none of them, the new girl greeted them all by name. One of them asked how long she was going to be with them, and she replied, "The angels will let me stay until sometime in May." Well, for the next several months, Lorancy lived as Mary Roth, and it seemed that she'd forgotten her old life, or if the possession was genuine, she never knew the life as Lorancy at all. As the days passed, the girl continued to show that she knew more about the Roth family, their possessions, and their daily habits than she could have possibly have known if she was only pretending to be Mary. She often referenced incidents and family events that occurred years before Lorancy was born. Now, these were things that were not common knowledge to anyone outside of the immediate family. So if the possession was a hoax, how could she have known these things? She recognized clothing, letters she'd written, all kinds of things. Friends and neighbors came to visit, people from town. Hundreds of people witnessed this, many of them sworn statements that Mary Roth had returned from the grave. The girl seemed to have the personality of Mary, but physically, she was still Lorancy. Now, this should have meant that she was still in danger of the spells and seizures that had become part of Lorancy's daily life, but now they'd stopped. Then in early May, she informed Dorothy Roth that Lorancy would be returning soon. And over the next 2 weeks, she hugged her family and wept, saying goodbye to everyone, saddened that she would never see them again. And on May 22nd, Lorancy returned. She went home soon after and back to her normal life. One thing that was immediately noticeable about her was that the symptoms of her terrible illness were gone. She'd been cured, apparently thanks to the intervention of Mary Roth. She was a healthy and happy young woman, suffering no ill effects from her strange experience. Lorancy had no memories of the possession, except for the things she'd said that Mary allowed her to know. The recent months were just a blank spot in her memory. Now, those memories would never return, but Mary Roth would. Lorancy remained in touch with the Roth family for the rest of her life. This is her, slightly older. Although she had no real memories of her time as Mary, she still felt a curious closeness to the Roths that she could never explain. On January 1st, 1882, she married George Benning, a farmer from Watseka. In 1884, they moved west to Rawlins County, Kansas. The Roths visited Lorancy often and saw her at least once a year after she moved to Kansas. Whenever she returned to Watseka to see her parents, she always stayed with the Roths for a part of the time. During these visits, she allowed Mary to take control of her so that she could remain in touch with her family. And for a few short hours, their daughter was returned to them again. Well, aside from these visits, Lorancy did not use the skills she'd acquired during her time as Mary. Her parents rarely spoke with her on the subject, fearing it would cause the return of the spells that had bothered her before the possession. Her husband, George, had no interest in spiritualism and forbid his wife to talk about it. Besides that, with household chores and the raising of 5 children, she didn't have a whole lot of time for Mary Roth anyway. Lorancy lived in Kansas until the death of her husband in 1916. After that, she moved to Oklahoma for a time and then eventually settled in Long Beach, California. She died there at the age of 88 in 1952. It was not until her death that her children learned of her strange time as what the newspapers called the Watseka Wonder. To this day, what happened in Watseka remains a mystery. Some claim it was a hoax, while others suggest a split personality, and many maintain it was exactly what it appeared to be, a ghost that took over a girl's body and saved her life. Hundreds in town witnessed it, and it was incredibly well documented. And while hard evidence remains elusive, it's clear that something happened in Watseka in 1878, or we wouldn't still be talking about it today. But what was it really? Well, I guess that's up to you to decide. Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, is the burial place of some of the biggest names in Chicago gangland history, including Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Dean O'Banion, Jaime Weiss, and many others. But it's also the burial place of a woman who's come to be known as the Italian Bride. Julia Baccola was born in Italy in June of 1891. Her father, George, passed away in 1913, and her mother, Philomena, brought Julia with her to the United States. They settled on the west side of Chicago, where 3 other Baccola children, Henry, Joseph, and Roselia, were already settled. In June of 1920, Julia married Matthew Petta at Holy Rosary Church on North Damon Avenue. She became pregnant soon after the wedding, but complications occurred, and on March 17th, 1921, Julia died while giving birth to her son, Philip. Because of the Italian tradition that dying in childbirth made the woman a type of martyr, Julia was buried in white, the martyr's color. Her wedding dress also served as her burial gown. And with her dead infant tucked into her arms, the two were laid to rest in a single coffin at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Well, her mother, Philomena, was inconsolable after her daughter's death. Shortly after Julia was buried, Philomena began to experience strange and terrifying dreams every night. In these nightmares, she envisioned Julia telling her that she was still alive and needed her help. And the dreams didn't stop. They continued for the next 6 years. During this time, she tried without success to have her daughter's grave opened and her body exhumed. She was unable to explain why she needed to do this. She only knew that she should. Finally, her persistence paid off, and a sympathetic judge granted the request. In 1927, 6 years after Julia died, the casket was removed from the grave. When it was opened, Julia's body was found not to have decayed at all. In fact, it was said that her flesh was still as soft as it had been when she was alive. She had somehow been completely preserved. A photograph was taken at the time of the exhumation and shows Julia's body, again, which had not decayed, lying in the casket. Philomena soon began raising money for a more elaborate tombstone, one that would be a tribute to her dead daughter and the miraculous preservation of her body. Her mother and other admirers attached the postmortem photo of Julia on the front of the grave monument, as well as a photo of Julia on her wedding day, which inspired the statue that was created as the centerpiece of that new monument. The postmortem photograph shows a body that appears to be fresh, with no discoloration of the skin, even after 6 years. The rotted and decayed appearance of the coffin in the photo, however, shows that it had been underground for some time, Julia, though, just looks to be sleeping. Her family took the fact that she was found to be so well preserved as a sign from God. And so, after collecting money from other family members and neighbors, they created the impressive monument that stands over her grave today. There's no rational explanation for how Julia's body stayed in perfect condition after 6 years in the grave. Many devout Catholics in the neighborhood believe that Julia's incorruptibility meant she was a saint, but skeptics scoffed at the idea, claiming the postmortem photo must have been taken before she was originally buried, although that doesn't explain the condition of the casket or the decomposition of the infant that it was in her arms. Others claimed it was something natural in the soil of the cemetery that preserved the body. But this doesn't explain why no other bodies in Mount Carmel have also been found in perfect condition. Of course, these explanations did little to dispel the local belief that Julia's preserved body was proof of a miracle. But there are stories that have since been told about her mother, Philomena, suggesting that she fabricated the story for petty revenge against Julia's husband, Matthew, who she never liked or approved of. Those who believe this story point to the fact that Julia's married name doesn't appear on the grave monument, only Bacola. But even if Philomena lied about her nightmares to gain sympathy from the community and to help finance the building of the elaborate monument, how does this explain that weird photograph? The photo of Julia in her casket 6 years after her death appears to be real. It's defied explanation for more than a century. But that's not the end of this odd story. Reports have been told over the years of a ghostly woman in white who's been seen wandering at the edge of the cemetery where Julia rests. Witnesses claim to have seen her in the daytime and at night, and many who know the story of Julia Petta believe this is her restless spirit. One eerie tale was told that involved a young boy who was accidentally left behind in the cemetery, not far from Julia's grave. When his parents returned to Mount Carmel to look for him, they saw him holding the hands of a dark-haired young woman in a white dress. When the boy ran toward his parents, the woman in white disappeared. Well, the story of the Italian bride lives on today. It's the story of a woman who became more famous in death than she ever was in life. Louisa Lutger, the wife of Chicago sausage maker Adolf Lutger, disappeared on May 1st, 1897. She was last seen crossing the street from her home to her husband's sausage factory with her husband around 10 p.m. that evening, and she was never seen again. Well, not alive anyway, but she has been seen. She's also become a legend. Her disappearance and possible murder caused a sensation in Chicago that summer, especially when it was discovered where she was going on her last night on Earth. It turned out to be the only crime in Chicago history that affected food sales over an entire summer. And it may also be one of the only crimes in Chicago history linked to a victim who haunted her husband into an early grave. But the story of Louisa Lutger's vengeful ghost can't be told without first introducing you to her husband, Adolf. Born in Germany in 1845, he came to America after the Civil War, settled in Quincy, Illinois, and started working in the meatpacking and leather business, saving his money and planning for the future. He eventually moved to Chicago, just in time for the Great Fire of 1871. When it was over, Lutger seized the opportunity to start a wholesale liquor business on the city's north side. He married Christine Ropke and had 2 children with her, one of whom died before he was 2. Then Christine died a short time later, so Lutger sent away his surviving son and started looking for a new wife. The search lasted all of 2 months. In January 1878, he married Louisa Bickness, a fellow German and a petite blonde woman who was 9 years younger and more than a foot shorter than her new husband. As a wedding gift, he gave her a unique gold ring with her initials, LL, inscribed inside. Little did he know that ring would eventually prove to be his undoing. Well, in 1879, Lutgert sold the property he owned, and the family moved to the Lakeview neighborhood, where he opened a saloon and liquor store. If Adolf had ever been a decent man at all, and honestly, that's open for debate, this is when his personality really began to change. He started cutting corners, cheating his customers. And when he bought a butcher shop and meat delivery service on North Avenue, he started selling low quality meat and sausage out the back door to neighbors in the area. And low quality meat in Chicago in the 19th century, that was really saying something. At the time, all the meat in the city was processed in the Southside Stockyards district, where conditions were so bad that Upton Sinclair wrote a book about it that was so stomach turning that when President Theodore Roosevelt read the book, he created the USDA to inspect meat. Anyway, Lutgert's sausage, whatever was in it, began making more money than his regular business, and that's when he decided to make another change. First, he started a packing house at North and Sheffield Avenues, which employed about 50 men. He invested in artificial refrigeration and became the first sausage maker in the city to manufacture his product in the summer and winter. The family lived in a flat on the third floor of the building, but Louisa hated the smell so much, she pressured him to move again. Lutgert borrowed more than $140,000 to purchase 5 acres at the corner of Hermitage and Diversey Streets. He built a home for his family, subdivided most of the land into 18 building plots for a neighborhood, and then constructed a state-of-the-art sausage manufacturing plant. But he didn't have many friends in the neighborhood. His reputation was so bad that even fellow Germans couldn't tolerate him. The men despised him, but the ladies, well, that was another story. He had a roving eye that soon led to illicit affairs with women in the neighborhood, all of whom would later turn on him during his murder trials. Even so, business boomed for a while. His sausage was acclaimed throughout the city, and he was even sold in the German restaurant at the 1893 World's Fair. But it would be the end of the fair that started Lutgert's business troubles. Thanks to the bank panic and financial depression that followed the fair, Lutgert found that many of those who'd ordered his product were now unable to sell it. Lutgert made deals, trying to settle outstanding bills for pennies on the dollar and sinking all the money he had into the packing plant. Unable to pay off his loans, he tried to sell his company, but deals fell through and he was soon in deep trouble. The factory was closed and most of the workers were laid off over the next 2 years. Notes were coming due and Lutgert worried that his creditors would take everything he had left. Not surprisingly, his marriage began falling apart. Friends, relatives, and neighbors began reporting terrible fights between Adolf and Louisa. Screaming matches in German could be heard from the street. Louisa scolded her husband for his ways with other women, his business failures, and his increasing debts. Things became so bad that Lutgert eventually moved his bedroom from the house to a small room in the factory across the street. The Lutgert's maid, who was Louisa's niece, Mary Simmerling, made Adolf's bed in the factory each morning. But Louisa believed she was doing more than just tucking in his sheets. Although what she did suspect did rhyme with tucking. We'll leave it at that. The neighbors certainly had a lot to talk about. One night, Adolf responded to Louisa's complaints by grabbing her by the throat and choking her against the wall. He might have killed her, but noticed some neighbors had stopped to stare at them through their front window. A few days later, Adolf was seen chasing her down the street, yelling in German, waving a revolver. He drew a crowd, turned back, and walked back to the factory. Their marriage wouldn't last much longer. On May 1st, 1897, Louisa disappeared. Mary Simmerling, no surprise there, along with some of Adolf's close friends, would later tell the police that Louisa had been acting strangely for at least 2 weeks before she vanished. They feared she might be insane. They were not shocked, they claimed, to find that she'd run away. Well, others were not so sure, including all those neighbors who'd seen the violent arguments. The friend who'd seen Louisa during the evening on May 1st, and those who knew her who would never abandon her two children. At first, only a handful of people even knew Louisa was gone. Adolf told them that he'd argued and that she'd left him. One of his attorneys, who was trying to keep the bank from foreclosing on the sausage factory, told him it would look better to his creditors if Adolf could find Louisa and get her to come home. Well, before he left that attorney's office, Adolf ominously said he would look for her, but unless he planned to use a medium to contact the spirit world, he doubted to be able to reach his wife. Well, at this point, when no one was looking for Louisa because most people didn't know he was missing, everyone who came to the house was told she was busy or sleeping by Mary Simmerling. Finally, this guy, Louisa's brother, Diedrich, who had been given this excuse one too many times, went to see Lutgert and demanded to know where his sister was. Lutgert just acted surprised. He said he assumed Louisa was with her family, but he told Diedrich she'd left him. She'd gone off with another man. Well, Diedrich knew better and knew she would not have left her children. When he asked Lutgert if he'd tried to find her, Adolf told her he told Diedrich that he'd paid two detectives $5 to look for her because he didn't want to tell the Chicago police that she was gone. You see, he was an important businessman, he said, and he admitted that his wife had left him would be too embarrassing. Well, Diedrich began searching on his own. He questioned Mary Simmerling and went to see his relatives in Chicago and in the Fox River area where Louisa had lived before she was married. He searched her room and found all her clothing and belongings were still there. If she'd left, she'd taken nothing with her. Diedrich now feared the worst. Louisa had now been missing for a week, and Diedrich didn't wait any longer. He went to see the police. He reported his sister's disappearance to Captain Herman Schutler. Well, the search began the next day. Schutler himself questioned Adolf Lutgert and was told the same story that Adolf had been telling others, but the detective had trouble believing him. He once recalled that Lutgert had called him every day when two of his dogs went missing, demanding that the police find them. But his wife had disappeared and he'd failed to report it. As officers and detectives began talking to people in the neighborhood, they began to hear some unsettling stories about the Lutgert marriage, including about the fights, the violence, and the threats. Of course, beating your wife wasn't a police matter at that time, but hey, murder certainly was. They searched alleyways. They dragged the nearby river. They searched the ash piles behind the factory, oddly turning up what appeared to be half-burned strips of metal from a woman's corset, but they didn't find anything else. Well, things soon became more unsettling. A teamster named William Fullback told police he'd seen Louisa near the sausage factory in the night of May 1st. A neighborhood girl named Emma Schimke had also seen her that night. She saw Louisa and her husband enter the sausage factory together. A night watchman at the factory named Frank Billick confirmed both stories. He'd also seen Louisa and Adolf at the sausage factory that night. He'd only seen Louisa once when she came in, but he saw Adolf several times. He'd also noticed that Adolf had turned on the steam under the middle sausage vat in the basement that night around 9 p.m., which was really strange since the factory was closed. Oh, when he saw Adolf again the next morning, he asked him if the steam needed to be turned off, but he was told to keep it running. When Frank went down to check on the vat, he noticed a brown, sticky substance on the floor. It contained some bits of bone, but I mean, hey, it was sausage after all, so he didn't think much of it. Another employee, Frank Odorowski, who was apparently quite entertaining when he testified in court based on this image of him here in the center, he told police he'd also seen the stain on the floor. He thought someone had boiled something without Lutgert's knowledge, so he went to tell him about it. But Lutgert knew and told him not to talk about it. If he kept silent, he said, Frank would have a job for life. Well, Frank scraped up the mess on the floor and washed it down the drain. Some of the bones and larger bits, though, he scattered out along the railroad tracks, all on Lutgert's orders. With this new information, Captain Schutler realized a complete search of the sausage factory was needed. But even the veteran detective wasn't prepared for what they'd find. The basement of the factory had 3 wooden vats in it. Each was about 12 feet long and divided into 2 sections. They were used for dipping the sausages into a salty solution that preserved them. Well, normally that's what they were used for. Officers discovered that the middle vat was filled with a brownish liquid. Inspector Schock ordered them to empty the tank and hold a gunny sack over the drain to catch anything besides liquid that came out. And yes, this was as disgusting as it sounds. The murky, chunky liquid came pouring out, and between what was caught in the bag and what was found when officers climbed into the vat and started rooting around in the muck, they found a tooth, bits of bone that looked human, part of a skull, and 2 shiny objects that looked like rings. One was a plain gold wedding band, but the other was much heavier. When the inspector peered at it closely, he saw 2 initials in German Gothic script. The initials were LL, Louisa Lutgert. Adolf had been frantic during the search of the factory, wondering what the police were looking for. Well, he didn't have long to wait and find out. Captain Schutler soon arrested him for murdering his wife. Now, I included this image right here. It doesn't have anything to do with the story. It was just an advertising postcard for the sausage factory. But I mean, the picture alone, to think that was used for advertising, I couldn't resist. So I apologize. Well, news quickly spread about what was happening. Special editions of the newspapers said that as people snapped them up to find out the latest news of the disappearance and possible murder, the police were accusing Lutgert of dissolving his wife in harsh chemicals. But rumors spread that he'd ground her up into sausage instead. Needless to say, sausage sales plummeted in Chicago in the summer of 1897. Lutgert was confined at the Cook County Jail during his trial. A parade of witnesses provided damning evidence, while Lutgert's attorneys tried to maintain that Louisa wasn't dead, she'd just run away. That's why there was no body, they said. Chicago doctors, scientists, and teachers offered evidence about the fragments of bone that were found in the middle vat of the factory basement. Some claimed they were human, others said they were animals. That stuff was in its early days. The most damaging witnesses were the police officers who searched the factory and several of Lutgert's mistresses, who read aloud his love letters and testified about his hatred of his wife. The trial lasted for a month and ended in a hung jury. Well, Lutgert was thrilled, believing this meant he could go home, but it didn't. He remained in jail. He had to prepare for another trial, and by now, he was broke. While friends tried to raise money for a new defense, Lutgert was fending off dozens of offers of marriage that were pouring into the jail. But he didn't need a new wife. He needed money. At the second trial, Lutgert was forced to hire another attorney, one that was much cheaper and possibly a little nuts. His name was Lawrence Harmon. If there was anything you could say for Harmon, he certainly believed in his client's innocence. He spent the entire trial arguing with the judge, calling witnesses who swore they'd seen Louisa alive, and at one point tried to blame Louisa's murder on serial killer H.H. Holmes. He also made an even bigger mistake. He let Lutgert take the stand in his own defense, which was something his more experienced attorneys didn't allow him to do in the first trial. They knew the jury would hate him, and they did. Now, you're probably not surprised to learn that Lutgert lost the second case. The jury convicted him of murder just hours after they began their deliberations. Lawrence Harmon never got over the loss. He never stopped believing his client, and he never stopped believing that Louisa was alive. He spent his entire fortune chasing this belief, and it eventually drove him insane. He ended his life in a mental institution. As for Lutgert, he was sent to Joliet Penitentiary to spend the rest of his life. He was given a single cell, a prison uniform, sheets, a blanket, a stool, a mirror, a crock that held drinking water, and a waste bucket. He worked each day, first in the harness shop, in the chair making shop, and then, ironically, was put in charge of the meats in the cold storage warehouse. He was described as a model prisoner that first year, but in 1899, that began to change. He spoke less and quarreled with other convicts. He was put into solitary confinement after a fight with a man from the armor company about the quality of meat that was being delivered to the prison. The only person he spoke with was a man named Nick Marzin, a former meat packer who had also been sent to Joliet for murder. It was Marzin who would eventually reveal what changed Lutgert's personality. On July 27th, 1899, Lutgert didn't leave his cell for breakfast. He was discovered by guards groaning in pain. He was carried out into the corridor where he could get some fresh air, but it was too late. He was convulsing and gasping for air, and then he just simply died. It was first assumed he died from heart problems, but the coroner revealed that his liver was greatly enlarged and deteriorated to the point that, quote, mental strain could have caused his death at any time. But what had caused this mental strain? Well, everyone knew that Lutgert's personality had changed over the past year. His loud, noisy nature had been replaced by a worn, exhausted, angry man who other convicts often said talked to himself at night. But Nick Marzin assured everyone that Lutgert had not been talking to himself. He was talking to Louisa's ghost, who he claimed was visiting him in his cell every night. She'd returned to haunt him, he said, intent on revenge. Now, was this true or was it a hallucination? No one knows, but Adolf would not be the last person or place to be haunted by Louisa's ghost. Louisa Lutgert was, of course, never seen alive again. At one time, a creditor that was suing the Lutgert family demanded her presence in court, but despite his best efforts, she didn't appear. The Lutgert house became an object of fear. The yard became wild and overgrown with weeds. From time to time, a tenant rented the place, but never stayed there for long. The neighborhood stated that Louisa did not rest in peace. Her ghost was often seen in the house. Many claim that when passing by after dark, she was seen in the window wearing a white dress. The sausage factory also stood empty for several years, hanging over the neighborhood as a reminder for what happened there in 1897. The windows were broken and trespassers were common. After Lutgert's estate was finally settled in 1900, the factory was purchased at auction by the Library Bureau Company, which had started the Dewey Decimal System for libraries. They leased the factory as a warehouse and during their renovations, finally discarded the infamous sausage vats in the basement. And then on June 26, 1904, a fire broke out in the former factory and it gutted the entire building. It took hours to put out the blaze and took 14 engines to do it. The fire burned so hot the nearby railroad line had to be closed till they could put out the flames. When it was over, the building was still standing, but everything inside had been destroyed. No one could figure out how the fire had started, but investigators were able to pinpoint the exact spot where the fire began. As a spokesman for the fire department said, quote, "The source of the fire is a mystery, and no one has been able to offer any better explanation than the superstitious folk who have an idea that supernatural intervention has been invoked." You see, the fire started in the basement, in the exact spot where Lutgert's middle sausage vat, where Louisa's body had been boiled, had been located. Well, time moved on. In 1907, the old Lutgert house was moved from across from the factory to another lot in the neighborhood, hoping to dispel the grim memories and maybe the ghost. That part of Hermitage Avenue that intersected with Diversey was closed, and the old sausage factory was left to crumble for nearly a century. And then in 1999, the 100th anniversary of Adolf Lutgert's death, the former sausage factory was converted into loft condominiums. A new neighborhood of coffee shops, boutique stores, and high-end restaurants replaced the rundown houses and buildings that used to be there. But that's not quite the end of the story. Legends of Chicago's Northwest Side say that Louisa Lutgert's spirit still walks. If this is true, though, it's likely she no longer recognizes the neighborhood in which she once lived. They say, however, that if you happen to be along the street by the old sausage factory on May 1st, there's a chance you might see her lonely ghost crossing the street from where her home once was to the factory that she never left. If you do see her, have a kind thought for a woman whose life was one of hardship and abuse, but rest easy in the fact that she eventually had her revenge. Now, I've saved my favorite story for last, and this is not just my favorite Illinois story. It's my favorite ghost story of all time. And I first discovered it thanks to a box of cereal. One Halloween season in the late 1970s, my mother purchased a box of honeycomb cereal at the grocery store. That October, the cereal maker decided to manufacture boxes with 3 different 45 RPM records pressed into the cardboard. Each of the records had a different story on it, and once you finished eating all the cereal, you could cut it out of the box and play it on your record player. I don't remember what one of the stories, The Miser's Gold, was about, but I do remember the second one was a dramatized version of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. The other one was The Vanishing Hitchhiker. I remember sitting in front of the record player in our basement, listening to the scratchy sounds of the story on the record. I mean, the quality was not great, but then again, it used to be part of the cereal box. But I can remember my hair standing on end when I heard about a man picking up a young woman along the road one night, only to have her mysteriously disappear from his car. Well, that story had a big impact on 10-year-old me and began my fascination with vanishing hitchhikers. I started collecting every story, legend, and book that even mentioned the subject that I could find, and the Chicago area just kept coming up in a lot of material that I found. Well, stories about vanishing hitchhikers have been part of American lore for years. Many refer to them as the classic automobile legend, but a lot of the stories are even older than that. But there are a lot of variations to the story, but the basic one goes something like this. One cold and rainy night, a young man was on his way to a party at a local dance hall. And on his way there, he offered a ride to an attractive young woman who agreed to go with him to the dance. They spent the evening together, and then he offered to drive her home. The night had gotten colder, so he gave her his jacket to wear. He drove her to the address she gave him, and as they pulled into the driveway, he turned to tell her they'd arrived and was astonished to find her gone. The passenger seat of the car was empty. Although the door had never opened, the girl just simply vanished. Well, not knowing what else to do, he went up to the door and he knocked. An elderly woman answered the door, and he explained to her what had happened. And right away, she knew exactly what he was talking about. The girl he'd taken to the dance was her daughter, but she had died 10 years before in an automobile accident right on the bridge where he'd picked her up. Well, the horrified young man didn't believe her, even though the name of the girl he'd taken to the dance and the woman's daughter were the same. Well, to convince him, the old woman told him where to find the dead girl's grave in the local cemetery. Well, the young man quickly drove there, and following the directions he'd been given, found the tombstone with the girl's name on it. And folded neatly over the top of the grave marker was the jacket that the girl had borrowed to stay warm when they'd left the dance. Yeah, so we've all heard that story, I imagine. As I mentioned earlier, the vanishing hitchhiker story I heard on that record kicked off a fascination with stories of ghosts that hitch rides on American highways. But then when I was in high school in the early 1980s, I started hearing stories about a Chicago ghost that was hitching rides along Archer Avenue on the south side of the city. She began to be called Resurrection Mary, and she's since become one of my favorite topics. But you see, Mary's no ordinary vanishing hitchhiker story. I like to say she is the vanishing hitchhiker story. She's not just an urban legend about some nameless driver who was a friend of mine's cousin. The story of Resurrection Mary is filled with real dates, real people, and takes place along a real highway, and is one of the only ghosts I've ever heard of who left physical evidence of her presence behind. You see, the legend of Resurrection Mary was born on August 10th, 1976. Around 10:30 p.m., a driver was passing by the front gates of Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois, and as he traveled along Archer Avenue, he happened to glance over and see a girl standing on the other side of the gates. He said that when he saw her, she was wearing a light-colored dress and was holding on to the iron bars of the gate. Driver was considerate enough to stop down the street at the Justice Police Station and alert them to the fact that someone had been accidentally locked in the cemetery at closing time. Well, a patrolman named Pat Homa responded to the call, but when he arrived at the cemetery gates, he couldn't find anyone there. But then he looked at the gates where the girl had been standing and saw something that chilled him to the bone. He found two of the bronze bars in the gate had been blackened, burned, and looked as though someone had taken two of the green-colored bars in their hands and had somehow squashed and twisted them. Within the marks were what looked to be skin texture prints and handprints that had been seared into the metal with incredible heat. The temperature blackened and burned the bars at just about the spot where a small woman's hands would have been. The police officer didn't keep the story to himself. In fact, the story of the handprints made the newspapers, and curiosity seekers came from all over the area to see them. Well, trying to discourage the crowd, cemetery officials attempted to remove the marks with a blowtorch, but that made them look even worse. Eventually, they just replaced the gates because they couldn't get people to stop coming to see them. Well, the incident in 1976 was the most widely reported encounter with what the newspapers were soon calling Resurrection Mary. They had to give her a name because the number of Mary sightings began to increase. People from many different walks of life, from cab drivers to clergy, claimed they picked her up and gave her rides. They encountered her in local night spots and saw her vanish from the passenger seats of their automobiles. The girl was usually described in the same way, wearing a white dress and having wavy blonde hair. Other types of accounts began to surface around this same time, too. In these stories, Mary was appearing on Archer Avenue, not trying to hitch a ride, but approaching passing cars. These reports, although unknown to those who submitted them, were almost identical to accounts that dated back to the middle 1930s. But no one knew this just yet. In the mid-1970s, accounts drivers reported a young woman who ran out in front of their automobiles on Archer, usually near Resurrection Cemetery. Sometimes the girl would vanish just before colliding with the car, and at other times, they could feel the impact and see her crumple and fall to the road as if she was seriously injured. When the motorist stopped and went to help the girl, she would either disappear before their eyes or no sign of her body was ever found. Now, this happened dozens of times, and Cook County Sheriff's officers were often called to the scene of these accidents. After finding shaken and frightened witnesses who believed they just hit someone on the road, they realized the incidents were not practical jokes. The young woman was almost always described in the same way: young, wearing a light-colored dress with brown curly hair. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. I thought she had blonde hair. Hold on. We'll come back to that. Another encounter with Resurrection Mary made big news in early 1979. Just a few minutes after midnight on January 12th, a cab driver was returning downtown, often after dropping off a passenger in Palos Hills. It was a cold winter's night, and a big storm was forecast to hit later that morning. Well, his route took him past the Old Willow Shopping Center, located at the intersection of Archer Avenue and Willow Springs Road. As he passed by, he saw a woman standing on the side of the roadway. She was underdressed for such a cold night, wearing only a white party dress, so he stopped and asked her if she was okay and asked where she was going. She replied she needed to get home. He offered to drop her off, and she got in the back seat. When he asked her if she needed to where to go, she said just keep going north on Archer Avenue. Well, as they drove, he commented on the weather, making conversation, but she didn't answer at first. She just stared out the window before she finally answered him in a mumbling voice. The snow came early this year. Well, after that, she was silent again until she finally called out, "Here, here." The startled driver jerked the steering wheel to the right and stopped in an open area in front of two metal gates. He looked across the road, searching for a house or a business, but there was nothing. She couldn't get out here. It was a cemetery, Resurrection Cemetery, in fact. When he looked back at the girl to tell her she couldn't get out, it was too late. She was already gone. The back seat was empty, even though the door had never opened. His story later appeared in the newspaper, introducing thousands more people to Resurrection Mary. But when the reporter who wrote the piece started delving into the legend, he found that despite recent sightings and encounters, this story was nothing new. People on the southwest side of Chicago were already familiar with it. They'd been telling the story since the 1930s. Well, it was a dark and stormy night. Actually, it wasn't. It was a cold and icy one. See, the legend of Resurrection Mary began at the O. Henry Ballroom, a rambling Tudor-style building on South Archer Avenue that was a popular place for swing and big band dancing during the middle 1930s. In those days, the ballroom was located on a secluded stretch of Archer Avenue in unincorporated Willow Springs. Young people from all over Chicago's southwest side came to the O. Henry for music and dancing because owner John Vertibar was known for booking the hottest bands in the area and the biggest acts that traveled around the country. The story goes that Mary came to the O. Henry one night with a boyfriend, and they spent the evening dancing and drinking. Well, at some point, they got into an argument, and Mary stormed out of the place. Even though it was a cold winter's night, she decided she would rather face a cold walk home than spend another minute with her obnoxious boyfriend. She left the ballroom and started walking up Archer Avenue. She hadn't gotten far when she was struck and killed by a passing automobile. The driver fled the scene, and Mary was left there to die. Her grieving parents buried her in Resurrection Cemetery, wearing her favorite party dress and her dancing shoes. And since that time, her spirit has been seen along Archer Avenue, perhaps trying to return to her grave after one last night among the living. Motorists started picking up a young woman on Archer Avenue, and once she was in the car, she offered them vague directions toward home, but then vanished from the automobile at the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. Or so the story went. That part of the story actually isn't true, but it makes a great legend. But the ballroom did have a strong connection to the real Mary. By the 1970s, it had been renamed the Willowbrook Ballroom and still had a reputation as an old school dance club. In fact, it still had a strong following, surviving hard times and changing music tastes until it was tragically destroyed by fire in 2016. But turning back the clock to the 1930s, the ghostly Mary began to be encountered at the ballroom, in the bathrooms, or on the dance floor, and at the bar by customers and employees alike. Reports usually told of an attractive young woman in a white party dress who was seen from the opposite side of the ballroom. Occasionally, she was dancing. At other times, she was just standing at the edge of the dance floor. Sometimes she vanished without warning, and on other occasions, she disappeared whenever someone tried to approach her. But mostly, Mary was still being seen on Archer Avenue. During the last weekend of August 1980, Mary was seen by dozens of people, including the deacon of the Greek Orthodox Church on Archer Avenue. Many of the witnesses contacted the Justice Police Department about their sightings. Squad cars were dispatched, and although the police couldn't explain the mass sightings of a young woman who wasn't present when they arrived, they did find the witnesses themselves. Many of them flagged down the officers to tell them what they'd just seen. Now, throughout the rest of the year, there were at least a dozen documented sightings of Mary by motorists, couples on dates, and restaurant employees. And then in May 1983, at least 5 different people saw Mary on Archer Avenue near the Willowbrook Ballroom. One of them, a bartender at Johnny's Route 83, was traveling home after work on a Friday night. Actually, it was early Saturday morning when she spotted a woman in a white dress. The bartender saw her for a moment, looked away for a split second, and then the girl was gone. Later that year, she was also spotted by employees at the Willowbrook Ballroom as they were cleaning up after closing time. The staff members admitted they'd always been on the lookout for a ghost, but never really expected to see her. And yet, there she was. There is another location besides the Willowbrook that has become linked to the story of Resurrection Mary over the years, and that's Chet's Melody Lounge. Located just across the road and a little south of the Resurrection Cemetery gates, the tavern opened around 1900 and for years served food and drink for those who came to bury their dead. In 1965, it was purchased by Chet and Clara Przinski, and since that time has earned its place in the legend of Resurrection Mary. Because the bar remains open into the early morning hours, it's one of the only places on this stretch of road that stays open. And it's often the first place where late night drivers come to look for the young woman who vanished from their car as they drove past on Archer Avenue. One of them was a cab driver who came in one night in 1973. He claimed that a young woman had jumped out of the back seat of his cab without paying. She ran off, and he came into Chet's because it was the only spot that was open and the closest place where she could have gone. He told the bartender she was an attractive blonde and that he was sure she'd come into the tavern. Well, staff members and customers assured the man no one had come inside, but he didn't believe them. To get the guy to shut up, Chet allowed him to search the restrooms and the rest of the bar, but there was simply no one fitting the girl's description in the place. Embarrassed and irritated, the man finally left. So you've heard the stories now, but it's unlikely I've suddenly turned all of you into believers. And this is no matter how many real people and places that I've mentioned. I mean, it's still a vanishing hitchhiker story that I first heard about from the back of a cereal box. Well, I told you, though, this isn't just a legend, but I haven't proven it to you. So how about if I introduce you to the woman, or in this case, two women, who became the most famous ghost in the area? During my research into the history of Resurrection Mary, I discovered the first reports of her came from the late spring of 1934. It was at this time that motorists on Archer Avenue, passing in front of the cemetery, began describing a young woman who would appear on the roadway as if trying to hitch a ride. On some occasions, she became frantic as cars passed by. Motorists told of a woman running toward them across the road, trying to climb onto the running boards of their automobiles, and sometimes even trying to climb into the open back windows. Well, they all described her the same way, wearing a light-colored dress and having curly brown hair that didn't quite reach her shoulders. Well, this was frightening enough. But what made it more unnerving was that many of the people in those automobiles, all residents of the Southwest Side, recognized the woman. Her name was Mary Bergovi. I'm sorry, Marie Bergovi. And some of the motorists were her friends. They'd laughed with her, drank with her, and often danced with her at their favorite spot, the O. Henry Ballroom. But that had been in the past. When these motorists started seeing Marie on Archer Avenue, trying to flag them down for a ride, she'd been dead for several weeks. See, I believe Mary Bergovi was the original Resurrection Mary. Marie Bergovi, seen here in a very rare photograph that was given to me by the granddaughter of the woman standing next to her on the left, was 21 years old in March 1934. She was of Polish descent and was employed at a local factory in the Back of the Yards neighborhood, where she lived with her parents and her two younger brothers. Friends would later remember Marie as a fun and exciting girl who loved to go to parties and go out dancing, especially to the O. Henry, her favorite place. On the night of March 10th, 1934, Marie and her best friend, Vern Rutowski, went out dancing with two young men they'd recently met. They started the night at the O. Henry and then drove to downtown Chicago, where the club stayed open later. Tragically, on their way home, their car crashed into an L train support post at Lake Street and Wacker Drive downtown, and Marie was thrown through the windshield and instantly killed. Her body was taken to a neighborhood funeral home to prepare for her burial, and years later, the owner, John Satala, recalled how pretty she was and that she was buried in an orchid-colored dress. Now, Marie was buried in what was called a term grave in Resurrection Cemetery, a temporary spot until the family could afford to purchase a burial plot, but she was never moved. After World War II, when space was needed for more burial sites at Resurrection Cemetery, some of the term graves were moved, but others, like Marie's, were simply covered over. Her grave is somewhere in Resurrection Cemetery, but even so, she's never really rested in peace. Stories about Marie Bergovi's ghost began a short time after her death. In April 1934, a caretaker at Resurrection Cemetery telephoned funeral home director John Satala and told him that he had seen the barefooted ghost of a young girl walking around the cemetery. She was a lovely girl with light brown hair, he said, and she was wearing a pale orchid colored dress. The caretaker was positive the ghost was a woman that Satala had recently buried. John Satala later said he recognized the description of the girl as Marie Bergovi. Well, soon after that, other stories began to circulate, claiming that motorists on Archer in front of the cemetery were encountering a frantic woman who tried to hitch a ride from them. And these Archer Avenue sightings also included reports from those who recognized the ghost of Marie Bergovi. Now, these became the first stories of a young woman hitching rides on Archer Avenue. Add in the fact that everyone loved the O. Henry Ballroom, as Marie did when she was alive, and the story began to grow. Like I said, I believe Marie is the original Resurrection Mary, but I don't think she's the only one. Marie had curly brown hair, but a lot of people who picked up a ghost in their car described her as being a blonde. So who's that? Before I try and answer that, I have to tell you about the most famous encounter with her. I've already told you about all the motorists who picked her up along Archer, but there was at least one man who had a much closer encounter with her. His name was Jerry Palis, and his experience with Mary took place in 1939, but was so vivid, he never forgot it. When he died in 1992, he still insisted his story was true. He was an unshakable witness and eventually appeared on several television shows to discuss the night with Resurrection Mary. Other than that, he never became famous for his encounter. He had little to gain from his story and no reason to lie. He met the attractive blonde at the Liberty Grove in Hall one night, and they danced and spent several hours together. Later, Jerry would recall that her skin was very cold, almost icy to the touch. When he later kissed her, he found her lips were cold and clammy. At the end of the evening, the young woman asked Jerry for a ride home. He readily agreed to give her a lift, and when they got to his automobile, she explained that she lived on South Damon Avenue, but she wanted to take a ride down Archer Avenue first. Jerry agreed, and they drove off down Archer Avenue. Then, as they approached the gates to Resurrection Cemetery, the girl asked him to pull over. She had to get out here, she told him. Jerry was confused, unable to understand why she'd want to get out of such a spot, but he pulled the car over to the side of the road anyway. He agreed he'd let her out, but only if she allowed him to walk her to wherever she was going. There was a row of houses to the right, about a block off Archer Avenue, and he assumed she was going to one of those, and he wanted to make sure she made it there safely. Well, the beautiful young girl refused to allow this, though. She turned in her seat and faced Jerry and spoke softly. "This is where I have to get out, but where I'm going, you can't follow." Before he could respond, the girl got out of the car and ran not in the direction of the houses, but across Archer Avenue toward the gates to Resurrection Cemetery. She vanished before she reached them, right before Jerry's eyes. And that was the moment when he knew that he'd spent the evening with a ghost. But who was the woman that Jerry danced with that night? Well, in July 2005, I thought I got my answer. I received a letter from a woman who promised me information about Resurrection Mary, claiming the living counterpart of Mary had once been her mother's babysitter when she was a child. And if I was interested, I could call her and get more information. So you better bet I called. According to her mother, a young woman named Mary Miskowski had lived down the street from her family when she was a child. Mary often babysat for neighborhood children to earn extra money. She wasn't sure if Mary had a regular job or not. She lived with her parents, she recalled, but Mary was old enough to be out of school. She described her as being a very pretty girl and told me she had light blonde hair with a little bit of curl to it. It was cut short just below her ears. All the boys in the neighborhood were in love with her, she said. I do remember she liked to go on dates, but I don't recall she had any one boyfriend in particular. Mary loved to go out dancing, including to the O. Henry Ballroom, which had opened in 1921. Her favorite place, though, was the Liberty Grove and Hall. which was located about 12 blocks from her home. It seemed possible that Mary Miskowski could have been the blonde that Jerry Palis met on the night of his encounter. She might also be the blonde that so many other claim they have encountered over the years. But Mary's favorite dancing spot was not the only convincing part of their story. She told me that after I had gotten in touch with her, she'd ask her younger brother if he remembered anything about Mary. And he became very upset. There was something he'd never told her, he said. He believed he'd seen Mary after she died. He was a young man at the time and had just returned home from the Army after World War II. He was out for a drive one night on Archer Avenue and saw a woman standing on the side of the road. He slowed down to take a look at her, and as he did, the woman turned in his direction. He was stunned when he saw her face. It was his dead babysitter, Mary Miskowski. He slammed on his brakes and pulled over to the side of the road, looked for her, but the woman was gone. In a matter of seconds, she'd simply vanished. He was so shaken by the encounter, he didn't drive that particular stretch of Archer Avenue again for years. Now, I discovered that Mary Miskowski had been killed by a hit-and-run driver in October 1930. A car had struck her as she was crossing 47th Street and had sped away. Whoever the driver was, he was never caught. Now, this may have been how part of the story of Resurrection Mary being run over by a car and left for dead on Archer Avenue got mixed into the legend. Now, the story all made sense. Now I knew why Resurrection Mary was both a blonde who hangs out in dance halls and vanishes from cars and a brunette who tries to hitch rides on Archer Avenue. I had solved the mystery, or so I thought. Turns out things were not as simple as I believed they were. Mary Miskowski had lived at this house on South Damon Avenue in 1930. She'd been 19 years old, but she didn't die that October. She'd gotten married instead. In fact, she didn't die until 1956 when she was 45 years old. So this was apparently not the same girl that the family told me had died in 1930. Now, had they been confused? Was Mary their babysitter, or was it someone else who lived on the block? Well, unfortunately, at this point, they've passed away, so I have no way to ask them. I find it hard to believe that an 85-year-old woman and her brother, who was almost as old, would have come up with an elaborate prank about their old babysitter and Resurrection Mary, but I suppose it's possible. Unlikely, but still possible. What's more likely is that they confused some names. And while they knew Mary Miskowski, she didn't die in 1930. Someone they knew did die, though, and whoever that young woman was might have been one of the ghosts who went on to create the legend. But whoever she was, I'll bet she was a blonde. Regardless, I still think that Resurrection Mary, the legendary spirit, is not one ghost, but two. But who knows? Maybe there's even more of them. There were a lot of Marys among first and second generation immigrant families who lived on the southwest side of Chicago in the 1920s and 30s. And who knows? Maybe her name doesn't even have to be Mary. Even Marie Bergovi's name wasn't Mary. She went by Marie, probably because there were too many Marys in the neighborhood. There was even an older woman who lived down the street named Mary Bergovi, who had a daughter named Mary Bergovi. So that's really confusing. So maybe I didn't solve the mystery of Resurrection Mary, but I didn't discover why the encounters with her mostly stopped in the 1940s and then started back up again 3 decades later. You see, in the 1970s, Resurrection Cemetery began undergoing major renovations, including the movement of the term graves that had been in place for many years. Some of the graves were moved to other locations, while others, according to relatives who have loved ones buried in the cemetery, were reportedly just bulldozed under the earth. It's believed this disturbance may have been what caused Mary sightings to increase so dramatically in the 1970s and early 80s. But once the work was finished, the sightings began to fade away again, just as they had done years before. By the middle 1980s, they mostly stopped again. There were still Mary encounters into the 90s and sometimes even today, but authentic encounters with the ghost have become few and far between. This wasn't the first time Mary had disappeared. The last time she stayed away for more than 3 decades, and when she came back, well, she was having more fun than ever. It's been just about 35 years since Mary was active. So I have to wonder, are we due for her to make a comeback? If so, you can bet where you'll find me, driving up and down Archer Avenue late at night, keeping an eye out for a girl in a white dress hitchhiking on the side of the road. Well, thanks to all of you who joined me tonight. I hope you've enjoyed these ghost stories from your neck of the woods. As I mentioned earlier, I've written quite a few books, and you can order any of them from the website on your screen. Just be sure to mention you were part of the program tonight, and I'll make sure you get a little something extra with your order. Well, thanks again, and happy Halloween.
Thank you, Troy. That was a wonderful program. And thank you for the little gift at the end with the books. I would like to thank everyone for attending tonight's event. Please complete the pop-up survey that will appear when the Zoom ends. We always appreciate your feedback. The program was recorded and will be archived for 2 weeks. The link for the recording will be available by Wednesday. And for more information on upcoming programs, please visit the library's website at putnamcountylibrary.org. And I'll turn it back over to Troy for closing comments.
Well, thanks, guys. That's my closing comment is thank you again for tuning in tonight. And, we'd love to see all of you. I live quite some distance away from Putnam County. I'm down in the Alton, Illinois area, which is across the river from St. Louis. You might have seen it pop up recently as one of the most haunted small towns in America. So you probably understand why I live here. But I do have a museum in Alton called the American Oddities Museum, and it's a lot of fun if you like ghosts and just weird things. So anyway, if you get down this way, please let me know. I'd love to meet any of you in person. So thanks again, guys. And again, take care and have a very safe and happy Halloween. Thank you.